Okay, so freedom from violence, the basis for empowerment, is our next session. November 25th next week is the International Day for the Elimination of Violence Against Women, a day that is still needed because 1 in 3 women globally face physical or sexual violence. To unlock women's leadership, we must first erase the violence against women. To lead this important discussion, it is my great pleasure to welcome Annette Young. Originally from Australia, Annette is a senior journalist and presenter who's reported from Europe, Asia, and the Middle East. When not fronting France 24's show on women's issues, she's a news anchor and an international affairs commentator. Please join me now in welcoming Annette Young and her speakers. Wonderful.
Hello everyone, and welcome to this session entitled Freedom from Violence, the Basis for Empowerment, and most importantly, why it should matter to the business community, of which many of you are from here today. I'm Annette Young, the host and creator of The 51%, a show about women reshaping our world. It is the only program of its kind on any television global newscaster. Sadly, you're not going to find an equivalent on CNN, BBC, Al Jazeera, or on other global networks. So, what is this about? Freedom from violence is a fundamental precondition of a woman's ability to live, work, and express her full potential. Women and economies that they live in cannot thrive when they are subjected to violence. Yet 1 in 3 women globally face physical or sexual violence. And as we now know, the pandemic has only sadly exacerbated the problem. In all, gender violence costs the global economy some $110 billion a year. I'm going to repeat that statistic because it is extraordinary, $110 billion a year. So with that in mind, why should gender-based violence matter to the business community? Well, we're going to talk about that today. And joining me is Tatiana Mukanire, the National Coordinator of the National Movement of Survivors of Sexual Violence. She's a human rights activist in the Democratic Republic of Congo. She's also worked with the Dr. Denis Mukwege Foundation. She's our Firestarter speaker and will shortly kick off what will be a truly, and I imagine, engaging and organic discussion. Also joining us from the UK is Louise, Haigh, a Labour MP and the Shadow Secretary for Northern Ireland, coming in from via London. And we have with us Celine Bonnaire, the Executive Director of the Kering Foundation, our sole representative of the corporate sector, but as a result, a very important contributor to this discussion. As well, we have Elizabeth Johnston, the Executive Director of the European Forum for Urban Security, and from Paris, Anne-Cécile Malfer, the President of Fondation des Femmes, a women's activist here in France. So just to give you a quick idea of the rundown of this session, after Tatiana finishes her Firestarter speech, I'm going to be asking questions to our panellists and also a question to Tatiana herself before opening up the question to you, the audience, you here in the auditorium, but also there online watching this event. Tatiana, over to you.
En fait, je viens de la République démocratique du Congo où
For more than 25 years now, we've been at war, and we've when sexual violence has been used as a war weapon. I'm a survivor of one of these atrocities. And these violences didn't only destroy the physical woman, but also economically, because this woman who's on the verge of collapse, who's suffering in her humiliation, in her pain, who can't even, well, get herself up by her bootstraps, economically speaking, because she isn't stable. Patriarchy, discriminatory customs in our country mean that women can't raise themselves up directly to say no, to fight. Luckily, despite everything that's happened in my country, women have a huge amount of power. They get up despite the pain, despite the horrors imposed on her by the community. And we try and fight to help in the development of our country. We're not at an international level, but we do what we can in our own communities to contribute to the development of a community. It goes through projects that can be implemented by organizations. And, of course, it's not $1 million capital. It's just capital for these women, or at least to help them stand up, at least. It's important for them because they have reconstructed them as time goes on. And honestly, their economy is going to depend on their psychology, because when you don't go well economically, psychology, trauma, they re-emerge, and it becomes complicated for lots of women in my country, because nowadays we are helping 1 million women who are sexually abused in my country over the past 25 years. Oh, more than 25 years. And right now, in my country, as I am speaking these words, a woman is being raped in my country at this very moment. It's difficult, it's painful for us, it's difficult to express, but it's important to meet others, to tell them about what we are going through on a daily basis. We are suffering, but we're fighting in this despair without words. We're doing what we can to stand up. That's why I'm here today. We are fighting to go beyond the status of a victim to becoming leaders in the community, because women are peaceful, women are fighting. They're the pillars of society, and we are trying to do what we can to try and develop our country, to find sustainable peace in our country.
Tatiana, merci beaucoup. Thank you so much. I'll come back to you with a question in a moment, but I want to start off this discussion by going directly to Louise. In the UK, Louise, as we have talked about, 1 in 3 women will at some point in their lives experience physical or sexual violence. As we know, gender violence impacts all of us, either directly or indirectly. So why is it then consistently seen as the responsibility of governments and NGOs to address this issue?
Yeah, thank you. I mean, as you said earlier, I'm a Sheffield MP, which is a city in the north of England, but I'm also the spokesperson for the Labour Party for Northern Ireland. And I think about this issue particularly in the context of Northern Ireland, which is a post-conflict society, and which has never really addressed the legacy of the Troubles on women in Northern Ireland. We talk a lot about the violence that was experienced and inflicted by mostly men on the streets during that 4 decades conflict, but we don't think about or have addressed the legacy of the domestic abuse and the violence against women, sexual and physical, that was perpetrated through that period. And as is so often the case in post-conflict societies, once the violence comes to an end on the streets, it's very often brought into the home. And since the Troubles ended in with the signing of the Good Friday Agreement in 1998, domestic abuse has increased dramatically in Northern Ireland. Now, a part of the reason for that is because of improved reporting, but due to the nature of the post-conflict society in Northern Ireland, where significant swathes of the community are still controlled by paramilitaries, there is a silent epidemic of violence where women do not feel able to report because of that paramilitary influence. Now, just like in Northern Ireland, as the rest of the UK, of course, this falls to government to step in and to make sure that services are provided at every possible level, from early intervention and prevention, education in schools around sex and relationship education, which shockingly, until only very recently, was actually required to be on the curriculum in schools across England, let alone anywhere else in the UK, right through to crisis provision. And over the last 11 years, because of austerity, we have drastically reduced the number of refuge places available and the number of services that are available for victims and survivors of domestic abuse. So we're seeing really at every level victims and survivors of violence being let down by the state and by state agencies, and the government not doing anywhere near enough to step in and help women. Sadly, this really only becomes an issue when we see high-profile cases such as the recent murder of Sarah Everard, and suddenly, you know, the media is dominated and politicians suddenly take an interest. But in the interim, it's very often only very specific handful of campaigners, NGOs, and generally female politicians that take this seriously and are trying to bang the drum. But we've not seen anywhere near enough progress over the last several years. And in fact, in some regards, we've gone backwards because of austerity and because of those cuts to our public services.
Louise, thank you for that. Celine, why has the business sector been so slow to address this issue? Is it the case that it's seen as a problem that affects the lower income groups of society and therefore not the proviso of the corporate sector to address it? So what are your thoughts about that?
Well, I think that, you know, gender-based violence is a societal issue, and companies are part of the society. And there are still some stereotypes and lack of knowledge about gender-based violence and its impact on women. But I see a growing awareness from the private sector on the impact for the woman, on the impact in the workplace as well. And at Kering as a company, we believe that it is our responsibility to combat violence against women, and that private companies have a complementary role to take alongside the governments and the civil society.
Thank you. Elizabeth, as the head of a European-wide NGO, how important is it to build not only a national approach on this issue, but a regional approach, you know, in your case, across Europe?
I think it has to be a very local approach and a regional approach and a global approach. And if we're all moved by Tatiana's words, is because we realize it's a universal issue. So I think the issues are personal and therefore universal, but should be dealt with at a local level, in my opinion. Meaning, we talked about national government, we talked about businesses. I think cities have a huge role to play in coordinating all of those actors and in bringing different civil society actors, but also national governments, but also private sector. And we have lots of examples at local level throughout Europe of cities using their convening power, using their political legitimacy to make this an issue that private businesses can mobilize around. And I'm thinking not only big companies, but also the local pharmacy or the local supermarkets who, for instance, during COVID and lockdown, mobilized to welcome women so that they could seek support. When all of us know that we saw a big rise in domestic violence, and it was very hard to reach women at risk, some of our cities mobilized their pharmacies, their supermarkets, so that they could host support centers. So these are very concrete examples that of actions cities throughout Europe are taking and can do.
Tatiana, it's very common for survivors of violence to have shame about the incident, to feel that they have brought it upon themselves in some form or fashion. And it takes great strength for survivors to come forward, to speak out and identify the perpetrators. How can we as a society learn to be more open to what women, who tend to be the majority of survivors in this situation, to give them the encouragement and to make sure that we hear and, more importantly, do something about in terms of what has happened to them?
Well, with a tortioner, the first advantage a tortioner has when they've committed these sexual violence is the fact that the woman can't speak. She wants to hide, but hiding things makes her more vulnerable. She kills her slowly, but basically to reach a stage where a woman can speak out about what's happened to her, this to help her face up to these violences. For me, the best revenge I can have on my tortioners, on the people who tortured me, is the fact that I can speak out. And the fact that I can break the silence linked to rape. And I've managed to help other women in my country speak of their rape, even after 25 years. And that is something that really encourages me and others. Women who have followed other women, who've gone up to them and help them speak out. For women, they draw back into their own shell, where it makes them more vulnerable, and the whole patriarchy behind tramples them. Women don't emerge because we don't give them a chance to get up. We don't give them the strength to go on. And female solidarity, if I may say, will help these women overcome these issues. These people are together. They're going to work together to fight this scourge. That is how these women will have the courage to reintegrate the community. Thank you, says the moderator.
And Cecile, we're sitting here in the Louvre, in the centre of the French capital, very much symbolic of the power or, the elite who lived here at one point. I'd love you to give the audience an idea as to how pervasive gender-based violence is, particularly in a wealthy country such as France. Can you give us a sense of the statistics and what is the situation in this country?
Oui, bien sûr. Merci beaucoup déjà.
Thank you very much for having invited me to speak here today. We have in France a real issue with gender-based violence. 230 women or more are victims of domestic violence every year. 95% thousands are victims of rapes or attempted rape, and between 150 or 100 and 150 women are killed by their spies, domestic feminicides in France. So it was a slight drop in 2020, but it's about 120, 130 homicides per year. So the figures are very important. So we need to find who these victims are so we can create solutions to support associations that help women worldwide. We see this with companies and donors. We've had to explain to them that this a very strong link between equality between men and women and violence against women, gender-based violence. We can't have more equality if we don't fight violence against women. Most companies, including thanks to you, Women's Forum, have understood the importance of a place of women in companies, but we haven't understood yet that if we don't free women from this violence against women, we are going to reach another ceiling when it comes to gender equality. A very simple example. There's no point in paying for a workshop to encourage a manager or women to be more confident if her husband insults and beats her. So a company is also an actor of this violence against women. Otherwise, they'll never manage to be an actor of this fight for equality between men and women. And there's also this very strong link of a company, because we've seen this very often. Many companies saw this during the lockdown. Violence against women invited themselves into the company. So there were women who'd been working from home who were victims of violence at home, and they were working for a company. So we've seen managers and companies ask us what to do, but they were powerless. They didn't know what to do. They realized that there was no such thing as a hermetic limitation between a private world and what goes on at home and what goes on in a company. So we push countries, donors, private people, and also companies to act, because we can improve things if we mobilize ourselves together. And companies really play a major role for their staff, their customers, and more generally on the messages they get across through ad campaigns and information. And thanks to companies, governments, and private citizens, we can make it so that there's less women towards women.
Thank you. Louise, how can governments convince the business sector to do their bit? And how can both governments and the business sector come together and work on this issue?
Well, I think the figure that you gave at the start of this session was deeply troubling and shows the full extent of how much women's potential is being held back by the pervasiveness of gender-based violence in all economies and societies. But it shouldn't take a monetary figure to convince businesses, societies and governments that violence against women is a bad thing and that we all have a responsibility to tackle it. It was mentioned earlier about pharmacists during lockdown coming together to provide support centres. Scotland have really been leading the way on this for some time through their violence reduction unit and recognising the role that all individuals and businesses and services can have in helping detect and prevent domestic violence in particular. So they have been training up dentists, hairdressers, nail technicians, vets, in order to try and detect and ascertain when women in particular are subject to domestic violence, and to provide those interventions, because a lot of women trust their hairdressers and will talk to them in a way that they wouldn't necessarily talk to perhaps a social worker or a trained professional. Women may take their pets to the vets when their abusive partner has hurt the animal, but may not attend the doctors themselves when they've been hit. So there are really kind of low-key ways for businesses to come together as a community, as a society, to really help prevent and detect violence that would otherwise be hidden, and support those women and demonstrate that as a society we will not accept gender-based violence and that we all have a responsibility to help tackle it.
Celine, what exactly can the business community do? And given your work with the Kering Foundation, can you give us some examples of the sort of work that you've been involved with?
Yeah, sure. And to add on to Louise's explanation of the action of the public action, so the Kering Foundation to Combat Violence Against Women, which we do since 2008, so it's really a strong commitment from our chairman and CEO, François-Henri Pinault, and we act in three ways. We support local women-led organizations that provide services to survivors. We work with the youth, and in particular young men and boys, to promote gender equality. And we invite other stakeholders and private companies to come on board for this combat. And I will give two examples. One which is external, working on supporting a pilot project in France. It's called La Maison des Femmes à Saint-Denis, and the Kering Foundation was the first private funder of this new project, which had a multidisciplinary approach to provide 360-degree services to women survivors. And we supported them. We went to see our fellows, other private companies, to convince them about this project. And the fact that several private funders were supporting this project also convinced the public sector to fund the Maison des Femmes. And after 5 years, the impact of this project is demonstrated. And the Ministry of Health in France decided to fund the duplication of the project in France. And with other funders and Kering, we decided to finance 15 opening of Maisons des Femmes in the 5 coming years in France. So that's a public-private partnership. Internally, as Anne-Cécile was mentioning, since 2011, we train our employees about what is domestic violence, what impact it has on women survivors, and how, as colleagues and managers, we can support women who choose to disclose. It's 1 woman out of 4 who is a victim of domestic violence in Europe. It's the same figures in the US or in China. So we have survivors within our staff. And we believe it is our responsibility to give them a supportive workplace. So we provide trainings and we implemented some policies at group level, and we co-funded in 2018 the 1 in 3 Women Network with the FAST Foundation. So it's over 10 companies now that are engaged into combating violence against women. Companies such as L'Oréal, Carrefour, BNP Paribas, Kering. And all together, we share our best practices. We do some awareness inside our companies. We've set up an e-learning. So we work so that it's easier for women to come forward and to ask for support at the workplace.
Elizabeth, the time has come, however, to flip the script. We constantly put onus on women, all of you would have experienced this, on taking precautions to ensure our own safety. So it's us who absorbs that responsibility. So how do we turn that around so that the onus becomes on the men to end their violent behaviour? And how can workplaces, governments, government agencies and NGOs work towards that goal?
Thank you. I would almost, if I may, rephrase the question, how do we make sure it's all of society that takes this on, not only men? I think absolutely, I think it's the right question, and this is the time to ask to ask ourselves this question: is how is this not a women's issue? It's a whole of society issue. So I think we've made progress, honestly. In my career now, I've seen already progress being made. 10 years ago, 15 years ago, it was extremely difficult to convince someone who's interested, a mayor or local representative of government who's interested in violence reduction, violence prevention. It was extremely difficult to convince them that domestic violence was part of that. The separation between public and private was very strong. I think we've made progress in people understanding that a woman's experience at home follows her in the street, in public transportation, in her company, obviously at her workplace, in her leisure life. So I think we've started collectively to understand this sort of continuum of violence, and I think we're starting to understand, but this is what we need to deepen, the impact of violence against women, against the victims themselves, but against society as a whole. And you were mentioning this also, even from an economic and social development perspective for a country. The violence against women has a huge toll on the victims themselves, but on their children as well, and on the men as well. And the children themselves will then be more at risk of becoming perpetrators. And this is proven by every study, by every, when we look at perpetrators of violence, 9 out of 10 times, they come from a violent home. So the violence at home has an impact that concerns all of society. I think once we understand that, and once we accept that, we're also fighting against a polarized view of it's us versus them, it's the bad guy versus the good girl, or the women as victims and men as all perpetrators. And we need to find, and this is, and it's no easy task, and I don't have a magic wand to do this, but I think we're slowly making progress towards finding the arguments that it's a win-win. The fight against violence against women is not a women's issue. When you make at home, violence against women at home, or violence against women in cities, when you make a street safer for women, when you start taking into account women's perception of public spaces, it's safer for everyone. It's safer for men, it's safer for children, it's safer for visitors who don't know the city. So what benefits women benefits everyone.
Thank you, Elizabeth. And Cecile, Elizabeth touched on something there which to me is very symptomatic of French society, that division between private and public space. Privacy is a big issue in this country. So again, I want to ask you, as somebody who's a French activist in women's rights, how do you break down those cultural attitudes? I'm sorry, I think we're having technical issues. We're not able to hear Anne-Cécile.
Ah, c'est bon?
C'est bon maintenant, merci.
Vous m'entendez, c'est bon?
Oui.
Oui, donc il y a à la fois... c'est sûr que dans chaque pays, il va y avoir des résistances culturelles. Et dans chaque pays, on va trouver un discours pour justifier en fait que
There's this discourse that justifies the fact that domestic violence isn't that violent and it's worse elsewhere. In France, what we say what's important for French people is respecting their private life. We can also say what's important for French women is, for French gentlemen, you may have heard of that before. That is one of the arguments that is sometimes put forward to culturally fight the advances we've achieved. We are achieving in the sphere of public opinion, but we can't stop thinking these reflexes are the same in all countries. I think in Germany or the UK, we will justify it with national cultural reflexes. These behaviours are really violent and exist in all countries. We can't stick to this, but these resistance do exist. What we do at La Fondation des Femmes is we try and communicate to explain what these violences are and to explain how each and every one of us can act against these violence. Act against these violence can make donations to La Fondation des Femmes. We were created more than 6 years ago, and we've already paid back 5 million euros thanks to the donations we gave Native Republic. We've helped over 100,000 women through these associations we supported thanks to this money in our communication campaigns. We also try and speak to everyone, including men. So we've created a film, Tu seras un homme, mon fils, my son, you will be a man. It's a interpretation of a Kipling poem to say women have a role to play in the next generations. Men, coaches, daddies, your role models. You can lead by example, and explaining to boys how they need to behave towards women. They play an essential role to break this chain of reproduction of violence of one generation to the next. I hope I'm answering your question. And just in conclusion, the train for equality is going to go throughout France from the 26th of February to the 7th of March. We're going to go all over France in 10 cities. In every carriage, there'll be a different association that is supported by l'Association des Femmes, and we will raise awareness of the population and give them solutions and inform them of their rights and inequalities.
At this point, I'd like to open this session up to questions from the audience. First of all, here in the auditorium, is there anybody who would like to ask any of the panellists a specific question? If you could stand up and if a microphone could be provided to the audience member. Okay, I think okay. I think there's a microphone about to be given to you.
Hi, thank you very much for all your testimonies. I have a question. We've heard a lot about physical violence, which is obviously horrible, but I haven't heard anyone speak about verbal violence, which can be as undermining as physical violence.
Absolutely, and that is a question I was actually going to ask Louise too, because the Sarah Everard revealed a culture of toxic misogyny in the London police force. Is that question directed to any panellists, or would anyone here like to respond to the question there? It was discussion, yes, and Cécile, you'd like to respond.
Oui, effectivement, je n'ai pas défini, et je crois que nous n'avons pas défini ce que nous appelons des violences faites aux femmes. À la Fondation des femmes et en France, la définition
violence against women, but we usually say that this includes a series of instances of violence. Of course, this includes physical violence, so any physical violence that you can think of, but you also have sexual and psychological violence. This includes insults, the fact that you are not listened to, that you cannot express yourself, and we also have new forms of violence, which is something that is not taken into account by the public in general and by public authorities. I'm thinking of cyber violence. For example, when in a relationship the husband decides to change the codes to go on the social security website or other public websites that you need access to for your daily life. So this is a way for men, for example, to express their superiority, to have control over women, and this is something that we have seen in our charities and our associations as a form of violence against women. So yes, you are right. Violence against women can take multiple forms, and very often it is very difficult to define what is violence. It's not only about physical violence, it can also be psychological violence or any form of control that you try to have over women.
Again, I'd also like to add a little bit of the question there. The lesson for all of us from that Sarah Everard murder was toxic and misogynist workplace culture. Verbal violence is clearly part of that as well.
Absolutely, and I'm a former police officer myself in the Metropolitan Police, and I was horrified, not only at the details that came out about Sarah Everard's murderer and how he was allowed to express deeply misogynistic views that eventually earned him the nickname of the rapist internally within the police, and that he was never subject to any disciplinary hearings. But also with the Metropolitan Police's reaction once those details were in the public domain, that women who were approached by lone police officers should run away in order to protect themselves or to flag down the nearest bus. It's horrifying in 2021 for us to be having these kinds of conversations and for the Metropolitan Police not to have taken seriously deeply misogynistic views that were being expressed by individuals within their own ranks, and in this case that were permitted and licensed to carry firearms. Clearly in institutions such as the police or the armed forces, and we've seen in recent weeks the horrific details of a murder of a woman by a British Army soldier, and again, deeply misogynistic views that were being expressed in those ranks as well. Clearly, those institutions are going to attract people that want to exploit that position in order to express their own misogyny and potentially to express harm against women. And they need to go above and beyond to make sure that their vetting processes are stringent and that their day-to-day management and the culture in those institutions weeds out individuals like those. But clearly they are reflective of society as a whole. And I think it's really important that we do address verbal abuse because it's too often dismissed as banter or as harmless. And we need to all acknowledge that verbal abuse against women sits on a wider spectrum of objectification that eventually leads to violence against women and girls. And that's why the pervasiveness of it in society needs to be addressed. That's why education in schools is so important around sex and relationship education. And that's why all of us in business and in all institutions need to make sure that we're setting a culture and a leadership role in calling it out and in weeding out those individuals who express and harbour those views. It's also why the Labour Party have been calling for several years now to make misogyny an explicit hate crime in the UK, so that it's enforced for what it is, which is hatred against women, which is unacceptable on our streets and in our society.
Well, I'm sad to say that we've come to the end of the session, and I know because I can see there are arms raised and there are many questions people want to ask. But at this point, to wrap things up, I need to ask my panelists for a call to action. Tatiana, what would be your call to action?
Well, I would ask a women survivor to support other women feeling very low, because their strength is to be found in their foundation. So the women that they could support would in turn be able in the future to help other women. And this is particularly important for us living in countries where women are not as empowered as in Western countries. So this is why women should try and reinforce the institutions who help women in these countries, so that women can support each other and fight against this toxic sexism which destroys on a daily basis women as a whole. Thank you very much, Tatiana.
Elizabeth and Celine.
In one word, and maybe this is not easy for the interpreters, I'm sorry, I would say that let's put our money where our mouth is.
I think they can translate that.
It's, I think we know we have enough expertise worldwide on what we can do. We have so many good experiences in different sectors. Let's put our money where our mouth is and invest massively in prevention. I don't know why we wait at the end of the year to count the dead bodies or to count the number of Me Too movements also. And those are all fantastic mobilization movements, but we know these violence exists. We know what we could do to prevent them. We know, and I think this is something, unfortunately, we've learned collectively, and maybe through this COVID crisis, once again, is that prevention matters. It's a good investment. The cost of suffering all of these crises can be avoided. This is not an emerging threat. This is something that's existed for a long time. We have the expertise. We have the stakeholders that are mobilized. So my call to action would be, let's turn around also our budgeting as governments, as national governments, as local governments, as support to NGOs, but mostly let's turn it around 99% prevention instead of focusing only on post-fact sanction.
Thank you. Celine.
So my call to action will be for the private sector. At the Generation Equality Forum last June, Kering and the 1 in 3 Women Network took a commitment of getting 50 companies on board to combat violence against women over the next 5 years. So please join us and make real change happen.
Merci. And Cécile? I'm sorry, Anne-Cécile, I think the mute button is on.
Pardon. Je disais, je souscris totalement à ce qui a été dit.
I completely agree we should be more supportive among women and to have more resources on this topic.
Puis je rajouterais aussi
And
les
then
femmes au centre.
I think
Nous passons beaucoup de temps à nous préoccuper de
women
ne pas
spend a
froisser
lot
les
of
hommes,
time
attention à leur ego, attention à eux.
trying not
Ils sont au centre de
to
l'équation. Il faut que les
annoy
femmes
men,
aussi
trying
soient au
not
centre.
to
Vous, mesdames, chacune d'entre vous êtes importante.
bother
Les
men,
autres
but
femmes
actually
le
we
sont
should
aussi.
be at the
Il est temps
center
que
of
nous aussi,
attention.
nous
We
soyons au
are
centre de
important,
l'équation.
women are important, so we
Merci.
need to be at the center of the equation. Thank you very much.
And finally, but not lastly, Louise.
Well, can I echo everything that's been said on the panel? I completely support all those calls to action, but a particular plea, if I may, for Northern Ireland and for anyone involved in post-conflict studies to take a gendered approach, as indeed they have in Colombia, learning the lessons that we failed to learn in Northern Ireland in looking at that gendered approach. A particular project I'd really like colleagues to look into is the Training for Women network that works with women, particularly in those communities that are subject to paramilitary control, to empower them, equip them with the education and skills in order to break out from that coercive control that effectively exists over entire communities, and to empower them and free them from violence. So a perfect organisation to complement the discussion that we've had today.
Thank you. And at this point, can I ask all of you to give a warm round of applause to all of our panellists who've been amazing. Thank you, everybody.